I'm Ash. I'm Head of Research at Learning Work Institute and been really excited to be involved in this. Being Head of Research means that I'm insanely boring, and unlike the exciting stuff that Richard, Susan and Ricky are going to say, I'm going to give you a lecture in evaluation frameworks and methodology. But it provides a sort of backbone of how we've approached this whole development of the toolkit and evaluation framework. So I won't go through the context too much. I think we've covered the farm review. Just to cover off what Susan said earlier about the strands within family recommendations and where family learning sits within that. So it's nested within that. The important point for us is that sort of last sentence where the review really emphasised the need for evaluation and good quality evaluation and evidence to ensure that evidence on family learning and its impact could be demonstrated. And that's how we approached it. We kind of looked at what needs to happen to actually deliver that and be able to prove the value of family learning. So the first sort of thing we did was look at the existing evidence base, and this was partly to look at what we know, but also to kind of critically appraise it. So it's a process of understanding the strengths and the weaknesses. So some of the things that kind of came out were that there was a diverse range of outcomes that we're looking to demonstrate, or that the existing evidence base tries to demonstrate. However, as Susan mentioned, a lot of the research that's out there, or the evaluations I've done, rely on anecdotes or very small scale analysis. There's very few decent metrics out there that can be applied in prison context. So if you look at things like that you typically look at in the general population, like social isolation, which would be quite interesting to see within a prison context, a lot of the questioning around that is based around how much contact did you have with someone in an environment like a restaurant. It's just not going to work. There's a lot of self-selection bias, and this is where the anecdote thing comes into stuff, where the participants of these sort of small-scale evaluations were people that have had a really good outcome. It's really hard to find evidence of someone saying, I had a really terrible time, or this had, it didn't really kind of establish anything. And presentationally, it looks okay, but if you put that in front of a policymaker, decision maker, or someone that's an expert in evaluation, they question it, and it then undermines the whole evaluation. The long-term tracking, and we've covered this a couple of times, so the lack of coordination between prisons, but also the longer-term tracking of outcomes really undermines a lot of the evaluation, because you don't see outcomes transpire immediately. A lot of things that we're really interested in, increases in well-being, reductions in reoffending, more concrete family relationships take time to develop. And if you've got a 6-week intervention and all you're doing is your evaluation at the very end of that 6-week evaluation, you're not learning much about the actual proper impact or the proper outcome that you're demonstrating. And then there's the fact that a lot of evaluations look at things in isolation, and we know that at any one time, any one offender within an institution can be subjected to multiple interventions or learning, and unpicking which one has caused or led to the outcome it can be quite tricky. The often no counterfactual condition, I mean, that should have been its own bullet point, to be honest, and it's one of the trickiest things around evaluation. A lot of times we talk about impact of interventions, and when you mention impact, what you're actually saying is this is the added value of this course over not doing anything or doing something else. And that requires you splitting people into two groups, people that get the intervention, people that don't. You just don't have that often. So we need to look at other ways that we can demonstrate the impact. We can really pull apart how you can say family learning does lead to these impacts, and we know that because. And then we've already talked about the tick box exercise, about how people view evaluations. think part of that is because they just don't see it going anywhere. They might collect tutors might deliver forms and you receive them at the end. There might be a bit of reporting on it, and then it gets filed away. It's not really seen, it's not visible. And then the last point is quite pertinent. It's around the resources. When I started as a researcher, there used to be a rule of thumb that sort of if you were unleashing any sort of intervention or program, particularly a pilot, you should be earmarking between 5 and 10% of resource towards evaluation. And I've not seen that in the last 10, 15 years on any program. We're lucky if we get 0.5% of the program spend. So what ultimately happens is the people delivering the services end up doing the evaluation or doing the field work for it. There might be a researcher in the back office somewhere, or more likely someone gets commissioned to do a small scale study, but actually the frontline delivery is done by tutors, and they're not often cited on the benefits of it. That said, we did pick up some good evidence. I think you've got copies of these slides, so I won't run through what they are. But what we kind of found was, in the UK particularly, it's really hard to see a comprehensive view of the outcomes being achieved. So you might understand the more immediate or more obvious outcomes that you'd expect, so around family relationships and potentially reoffending. But some of the other things like well-being, relationships with staff, attitudes towards their circumstances, we don't really notice. Susan mentioned that the Parenting Inside Out programs in the US is a good example of research. It is a good study. The one thing I would say with that is the US has a different ethical standard within prisons more generally, but also when it comes to research, we just wouldn't be able to get away with the sort of work that they do there. And the other thing that we did pick up is that we're not the first ones to try and have a crack at this. There are some existing evaluation frameworks out there, and these are 3 that we kind of reviewed in quite a lot of detail. We've actually taken elements of those 3 frameworks where we think they're appropriate, and Ricky will cover off those actual tools in more detail. You've got the Improving Prisons Family Ties framework, Measuring Change in Offender Relationships, and the What is Prison Education For toolkit. All of them's kind of served a slightly different purpose and tested slightly different tools. What we've done is actually review those and compile those into a single set. The problem with the existing frameworks and the existing research generally was that they tended to look at family interventions or family learning, or offender learning, but not family learning specifically. I know we've talked about the sort of the difference between family interventions and family learning, and I agree with Susan. I think it's semantics. I think this is my own personal view, and I'm probably going to get shot by Susan for departing from party line on this. But I think that we need to be moving away from looking at what the shape of the intervention is to what the outcomes that you're trying to achieve are, and then say what works in the context of that. Covered off the sort of where family learning sits within the agreements for prisons. The third point is where we want to start really unpacking stuff. So where previous frameworks rely on questionnaires, they don't really provide a huge amount of guidance on what needs to be done to deliver those questionnaires, or the other alternative approaches you can use to get the data you need to demonstrate the outcomes or how the family learning is working. The other thing that we noticed is that previous frameworks, they provide the tools, but they don't really tell us much about triangulation. So this is taking multiple perspectives to look at the same issue, and that gives you a much better understanding and a much more reliable base to make decisions on. And it's quite a tricky thing to do, especially when you're trying to merge 3 different perspectives into one to provide an overview. It's a really powerful way of building internal reliability of that evaluation, but then also getting a really good understanding of what an intervention means for various actors, whether that's the offender, their family, or prison staff, or even wider than that. I'll skip through the rest of this, apart from that last point, which is the issue about frameworks not operating or at scale or being stress tested. One of the things that we found is that evaluations tended to be small scale. And so you needed the framework we've put together is something that works across prisons, across contexts, and can be aggregated. Because if you're only relying on a very small number of learners within one prison, you're not probably going to be able to demonstrate impact, or certainly not statistically. But what we're trying to achieve here is the ability to say, well, actually, even if you did it in that one context and you aggregated it with other prison interventions that are similar in form, and you looked at the impact, that's a really powerful tool. None of the other frameworks kind of looked at what would happen in terms of the aggregation or tried to systematize the collection of data so that that could occur. So once we started that, when we're building the building blocks of the evaluation framework, the main question we asked is, what is the point of this evaluation? What is the point that we're trying to deliver? And we came back to the point that anything that's being done, even at the smallest level, needs to kind of address MOJ strategic priorities, given the new the emerging commissioning process and the shift away from blanket service commissioning to more outcomes and more strategic commissioning processes. Anything that's not addressing the priorities makes you wonder why they're being commissioned. So that was the sort of main starting point about what our main outcomes are at for the evaluation. And we used what we call a theory-based evaluation approach. Now, theory-based evaluation or theory-based approaches are a way of looking at how you get to those final outcomes, how you can get to those final MOJ objectives through a particular activity at the beginning. You can use it for designing and describing any service, and it's a useful tool for service development. It's used quite widely, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you yourselves used it in the past, but it's used quite widely in the not-for-profit sector, and it's gained kind of more traction within government service design. But for us, we've used it for understanding what can be measured and how that can then be evaluated. And it's really useful here where you're looking at something that is inherently complicated with a lot of moving parts that lead to, not only are there a lot of moving parts, but there are a lot of interconnected parts that affect each other. And the approach kind of overcomes more traditional evaluation approaches, which literally look at, here's your here's your intervention, and here's your outcome. Did the intervention lead to the outcome, yes or no? And if it's a no, then it's marked as a failure. For these sort of interventions, that's just not good enough. It doesn't really explain why that outcome was never achieved. There are lots of things that could have occurred that led to that. So, in short, we use a theory of change approach, which is a form of theory-based evaluation, which helps us unpack why things occur and what sequence they occur in, and how an intervention ultimately leads to the outcome. So we kind of worked through this at various meetings with the steering group and through workshops with individual prisons, but also through the review of evidence that we did, and kind of unpacked how family learning in its broader sense, so again, kind of thinking about the aggregate here, works towards MOJ priorities, what kind of milestones the individual learners expected to make within as they go through family learning. At what points would you anticipate them getting the outcomes, and what are those outcomes? And then around that, what are the external influences that might affect whether a program is successful or not, or an intervention successful? So I think the theory of change has been shared. Sorry about the font size, it's very small, but this is what we created, and this is a very simplistic form of this. It did get much more complicated, and this kind of relates largely to the learners themselves. And I won't dwell on it too long, but just talking through how this works, these little boxes here, which you can't read at all, you might be able to see on the theory of change itself, interventions. The purple triangles here are the policy intentions, policy ambitions, and then as you work through, you get to what the sort of milestones are, what the intermediate outcomes are, and then what the higher level outcomes are. And the top three are the MOJ outcomes or ends that we're trying to address. The elements on the side are external influences and things beyond the control of the intervention that will affect the performance. And as I say, what this helps us do, it helps us visualize how the pathways that work, but it also helps us understand at what point can we start measuring things, who's the best person to then capture that information, and what measures can we use at those points. And that's the stuff that Ricky will unpack when she goes through the toolwork itself, the toolkit itself. So the one thing to note about that theory of change is it's what we call a program level of theory of change. So that's our first stage on this. So that's understanding family learning in its broader sense. So it's encapsulating all family learning. We would then look at doing, or we'd support you to do intervention level theory of change. So it's really looking at your own courses that you're running to understand how that might work. The third point is about then putting the measures and the evaluation in place, and that's what we've done with the toolkit. And then finally, there's the reporting back to different audiences. And again, there's a bit of a skill in tweaking your reporting depending on it, whether it's to a policymaker, whether it's to a prison governor, or whether it's to the learners themselves. And we've kind of put the learners involved because quite often when we're doing evaluation, we forget that actually feeding stuff back to the people that receive the service is useful. If you can say to a learner, if you take part in this course, if you take part in this intervention, we think you will benefit in this way because, and then present them with a bit of evidence that's quite accessible, it might engage them more readily. I'll just rattle through the sort of intervention level theory of change, just to kind of explain how the process works. So on the top line, you've got the sort of broad structure of intervention activity, intermediate outcome, and then the final goal. So just giving two examples, the final goal is to improve relationship with child, and that the activity or the intervention is a homework club. And you just work through the process of what it's supposed to involve, and then what the intermediate outcome is that leads to that final goal. Straightforward enough. The problem is it becomes quite complicated when you kind of unpack it and you explore the full range of activities that one intervention entails. The fact that multiple outcomes can be achieved by a single intervention, and it can feed into multiple ultimate goals as well. And then this gets even more complicated if you've got multiple interventions occurring at the same time. but as I say, it just helps us unpack that structure. And then, in terms of designing the evaluation methodology, as I mentioned at the beginning, triangulation is a really useful tool. So the toolkit that we've developed looks at how we can collect information using the theory of change from a variety of sources. So developed tools for children, wider family, the tutors, prison staff, and the learners themselves. We mentioned schools there, but I'm not sure if we got a specific schools-based tool. We looked at it in quite a lot of detail, but stepped back from it because of challenges around sort of informed consent, data sharing. But again, if an individual intervention is able to engage a school, I suspect it might be quite a powerful thing to see whether it affects the child's attainment. And on that, I'll wrap up.